Hello, this video essay is being submitted by a veteran who had a top secret clearance and is currently working on a piece that involves the CIA and casino mafia connection on military bases in Europe that has never been exposed before. This video essay that follows is entitled, "Did the Triumvirates of Republican Presidents, starting with Richard Nixon, then Gerald Ford, and then Ronald Reagan, take actions that mutually reinforced each other, even though these possible actions violated the law, in the possible relationship to JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963. The American public has been preached to for more than a century now by the establishment that in America no one is above the law, and that includes the president. American law clearly states that any American who makes contact with America's enemy has committed treason, and that treason is punishable by death. Since some Americans might consider that Richard Nixon and Watergate is close to ancient history, it is best to set down some chronological facts about the triumvirate of Republican presidents, of which Nixon was one, so as to be able to see their relationship to the JFK assassination. JFK, of course, was a Democrat. On Thursday, November 22nd, which is ironically Thanksgiving Day this year, is the 49th anniversary of JFK's assassination. Pardon me. If the American public faces up to the facts cited below, one cannot help but conclude that the facts speak for themselves, which means that the former presidents cited in the title of this piece have committed felony crimes, with two of them having committed treason, but none of them were even indicted, let alone prosecuted for their crimes. But the American public should have been able to surmise something like this on November 22nd, 1963, when JFK was assassinated. Thank goodness that at least the American public no longer believes the conclusion of the Warren Commission and General Ford, which contends that JFK was assassinated by a single gunman, namely Lee Harvey Oswald, and by wide margins of about 75% to 25%, Americans believe it was a conspiracy as against a single gunman. So there is some hope, but only a slim hope, as to the awakening of the American public as to who American presidential candidates really are. Obviously, not many of the American public have been influenced by former President Gerald Ford's book about Oswald having been the sole assassin. But the most outstanding aspect of this book by Ford is that it was written at all. For Gerald Ford has been in national politics for more than a quarter of a century, and Ford never submitted even one bill to Congress in that very long time frame. Also, President Ford has vetoed more bills than any other president. The two foregoing facts cited immediately above must certainly conclude that Ford has felt that everything is running just fine in America, and that this has been true for a long, long time. So let's start with some of the other relevant facts. Since some Americans might consider Nixon to be close to ancient history, it is best to first set down some chronological facts of this triumvirate of former Republican presidents in an orderly manner. 1. Richard Nixon, as of 1968 at the latest, had made contact with America's enemy, the North Vietnamese. Nixon did this without having held any current official position in the U.S. government, notwithstanding the fact that Nixon had been vice president from 1953 to 1961. This fact alone was enough to condemn Richard Nixon as having committed treason and to indict, to prosecute, and to sentence Nixon to death. As if this was not bad enough, Nixon actually conducted negotiations with the North Vietnamese, and did this while we were actually at war with the North Vietnamese. What makes this contact with the North Vietnamese so extraordinary was that Nixon had almost always been mistrustful of the CIA and the intelligence community in general. It must be recalled that Nixon was under great pressure via the Watergate investigation in 1973 and became preoccupied with the investigation, would reveal yet much greater danger of Nixon having participated in some form or other in the assassination of JFK. When Nixon was asked by a reporter if he had been in Dallas on the day of JFK's assassination, and Nixon responded in the strangely, LBJ, a Democrat, did not have his Department of Justice indict, prosecute, and convict Nixon. Why? It must be remembered that these two heads of two different parties met at Clint Murchison's estate near Dallas on the very night prior to JFK's assassination, and that LBJ was in such fear of these facts being uncovered and placed into the public domain that LBJ let Nixon alone with regards to Nixon's culpability. Could LBJ and Nixon have played some role in JFK's assassination? The chances are not negligible that both of them had. Gerald Ford had been appointed president by Richard Nixon on August 9, 1974, and served from then to January 1977 as president. Prior to being appointed to the presidency, Gerald Ford had served in the House for about a quarter of a century, but it was an undistinguished career. Of the 435 congressmen LBJ could choose from, one would have thought that LBJ would have picked a Democrat. But no, LBJ picked a Republican Congressman Ford. Not only that, but LBJ picked two neighbors of his and of each other, and those two were Ford and J. Edgar Hoover. Nor did LBJ conveniently pick neighbors. He picked two men, Ford and Hoover, with whom he was close friends. Of course, all three men met, LBJ, Ford, and Hoover, and had earlier taken an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. In addition, Ford took a fiduciary oath when he accepted a seat on the Warren Commission in 1964. Yet it was Ford who breached this Warren Commission oath, and he did it with impunity. For Ford reported to J. Edgar Hoover what had transpired behind those closed doors at the Warren Commission. This foregoing fact is not in dispute, for Hoover readily admitted it. Both Warren and Ford flew to Dallas to interview Jack Ruby in jail for having shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Ruby begged Ford and Warren to put him under federal protection and take him back to the Capitol, where he promised to spill all the beans on all the machinations leading up to the assassination of JFK. Both Ford and Warren did not want any of that. Making that decision to take Ruby to Washington, D.C. should have been a very easy one to make, and in the affirmative. The Warren Commission had already taken other parties to testify who were of less consequence than Jack Ruby. So what was the big problem? The big problem was that Jack Ruby had already disclosed that it was a conspiracy that assassinated JFK, and neither Ford or Warren wanted any of that. It is fair to characterize Jack Ruby as naive, but not more so than the average American. If one did a survey of the American public, it would probably be found that most Americans did not know that Gerald Ford was an attorney, like his friend Richard Nixon, which means that Ford recognized that what Nixon was doing with the North Vietnamese was treasonable. Ford would use Nixon as something of a model who committed crimes and got away with it because of his former credentials of being vice president. After Ford had been appointed president by his friend Nixon, Ford made a musical chairs out of it and pardoned Nixon in September 1974, which was against the advice Ford was receiving. The motivation of Gerald Ford was in much dispute as to the reasons Ford gave a complete pardon of Nixon, for the majority of political commentators contended that Ford would have won his battle with Jimmy Carter had Ford not pardoned Nixon.